Millionaire demanded that a humble elderly man leave a luxury hotel because he smelled bad. But when he found out who he really was, he was shocked. Richard Bennett was the epitome of the American success story. At 38, he presided over a real estate investment empire, with properties sprawled across the major cities of the United States. His impeccable demeanor, always dressed in tailored suits, and his steely gaze made it clear that he was acutely aware of his power. In Richard's mind, wealth equated to superiority, and he saw no reason to hide it. To him, life was a constant negotiation, and he always emerged victorious. That week, Richard was staying at a luxurious hotel in Austin, Texas, preparing to launch yet another billion-dollar project. Surrounded by every imaginable comfort, there was always something missing: genuine connection with others. Not that it bothered him, he preferred to keep an emotional distance from everyone and everything. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. One morning, while sipping coffee in the hotel lounge, Richard noticed a man entering who stood out starkly from the opulent surroundings. It was George Harris, an older gentleman in simple clothes and mud-stained boots. His weathered face bore the marks of years of hard labor, and there was a calmness in his demeanor that seemed almost out of place. George had come to the hotel for a meeting with his lawyer, but his presence immediately unsettled Richard, who wrinkled his nose at what he identified as the scent of earth and sweat. George walked slowly through the lounge, aware of the curious and judgmental gazes following him. It was nothing new, he was used to being judged by his appearance. His faded jeans and checkered shirt, though clean, showed the wear of a life spent working the land. He took a seat by the window, removing a straw hat that had weathered countless sunny mornings. Richard, seated just a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with an expression of disdain. To him, it was unacceptable that someone so out of place could occupy the same space, a space he believed was reserved for the elite. George seemed oblivious to Richard's hostility, calmly jotting notes in a small notebook as he waited for his lawyer. But for Richard, George's mere presence was an affront. Unable to contain his discomfort, Richard stood and, with purposeful strides, approached the older man. "Sir, do you realize where you are? This is not a place for farmhands," Richard said, his voice dripping with contempt. George looked up, surprised, but his composure remained intact. He offered a polite smile, unbothered by the insult. "I'm sorry if I've caused any inconvenience, but I have a meeting scheduled here. I'm just waiting," he replied in a calm, respectful tone. George's serene response only further irritated Richard, who felt his authority was being undermined. Shaking his head as though speaking to a stubborn child, Richard returned to his seat, muttering under his breath about how it was disgraceful to let just anyone in. George, meanwhile, remained unshaken. Years of toiling on the farm had taught him patience and the ability to disregard the opinions of others. He knew who he was and what he had achieved, and that was more than enough for him. The silence that followed the confrontation was tense, but George remained focused on his notebook. He had learned not to waste time on provocations. Meanwhile, Richard, seated just a few feet away, was still visibly agitated. He crossed his arms and glanced around as if expecting other guests to share his indignation, but most simply watched, intrigued by the scene. When George's lawyer arrived, the two began speaking in hushed tones. Richard couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. It was something about a proposal involving land and an environmental project. Though he didn't grasp the specifics, the mention of land piqued his interest. With business ventures scattered across the state, Richard was always on the lookout for expansion opportunities. What could an old farmer possibly have worth discussing? He thought, raising a skeptical eyebrow. George, on the other hand, was addressing a matter of great importance: protecting part of his land as a nature reserve. He had cultivated that land for decades and saw it as a legacy, something to remain untouched for future generations. His lawyer outlined the necessary steps, and George listened intently, occasionally asking straightforward, practical questions. Unable to suppress his curiosity, Richard began to speculate. Perhaps the old man was trying to sell some worthless property. For a fleeting moment, he even considered looking into who this man was. But he quickly dismissed the thought. In Richard's eyes, George was irrelevant. A waste of time, he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, George wrapped up his meeting with a firm handshake and a word of thanks to his lawyer. Rising from his seat, he placed his straw hat back on his head and left the lounge with the same serene demeanor with which he had entered. To him, the day was just another step toward what truly mattered, preserving what he loved and continuing his simple, fulfilling life. George exited the hotel with the peace of someone who knew he had done what was necessary. The day was far from over, and he needed to return to the farm before nightfall. The dusty, winding road seemed to mirror his life, full of challenges yet marked by a simple beauty he had learned to appreciate. When George arrived at the farm, he was greeted by the familiar sounds of cattle lowing and the excited barking of his dog, Max, who always ran to welcome him. The property was vast, with green fields stretching as far as the eye could see. George felt a quiet pride as he surveyed the land. Every inch of it was the result of years of hard work, sweat, and sacrifice. To him, this piece of the world was more than just property. It was the heart of his story, something he would never abandon. Across the city, Richard sat in his luxurious office, reviewing documents and spreadsheets. But his mind wasn't entirely on his work. The image of George lingered in his thoughts more than he cared to admit. Perhaps it was the old man's unshakable calm in the face of his arrogance or the intriguing bits of the conversation with the lawyer. Shaking his head, Richard tried to push the thoughts aside and refocused on his plans to expand a luxury resort on the outskirts of Dallas. Richard had an ambitious plan: to transform those lands into an exclusive destination with luxury hotels, golf courses, and breathtaking views. He had already acquired most of the properties necessary for his vision, but one crucial plot remained. Confident that money could solve any problem, he instructed his assistant to begin negotiations to purchase the remaining land. While George rested on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Richard was immersed in his world, plotting yet another financial victory. Neither of them could have guessed that their paths were about to cross again in a way that would forever change their lives. Richard's team quickly initiated negotiations to secure the final piece of land for the resort project. After a few phone calls, the assistants identified the owner of the property in question, George Harris. At first, this discovery seemed like a minor administrative detail. Richard didn't even bother to recall the name of the elderly man he'd encountered at the hotel. The proposal sent by Richard was generous, far above market value. He was accustomed to money resolving most issues. However, George received the offer with a calm smile and rejected it without hesitation. To him, the land was not for sale at any price. Its legacy and emotional significance were priceless. George's firm response took Richard's assistants by surprise, and they immediately relayed the news to their boss. In his office, Richard read the email containing the refusal and frowned deeply. He wasn't used to hearing no, especially when offering such an exorbitant amount. For Richard, this was a matter of principle. People like George couldn't simply refuse such a generous offer. Determined to overcome the obstacle, he instructed his team to increase the offer significantly and send a new proposal. On the other side, George remained steadfast. Richard's money didn't tempt him. He understood that land might be a mere asset to some, but to him it was far more than that. It was where his family had put down roots, where he had raised his son Ethan, and where he hoped future generations would thrive. He wrote a brief, polite reply, reiterating that the land was not for sale and thanking them for the offer. When Richard received the second rejection, he felt something beyond frustration. George's unwavering refusals stirred an unsettling curiosity within him. Who was this man who dared to turn down so much money? Why would anyone walk away from such a lucrative opportunity? From that moment on, Richard resolved to see the landowner for himself. As Richard strategized his next move to confront the stubborn landowner, George went about his daily routine on the farm, unaware of the growing unease in the millionaire's mind. To George, life continued at its natural pace. He spent his days overseeing the care of his cattle, mending fences, and checking the fields. In the evenings, he often sat on his porch with a warm cup of coffee, savoring the peace his land provided him. However, even with the simplicity of his routine, there was something new in George's life that brought him extra joy. His son Ethan was in a serious relationship with a young woman named Julia. George had noticed the sparkle in his son's eyes and the frequent conversations about her. Like his father, Ethan was a humble and hardworking man, but he carried a more modern outlook on life, blending rural heritage with youthful enthusiasm. One day, Ethan decided it was time to introduce Julia to his family. "Dad, I think I found the woman I want to spend my life with," he said, his smile a mixture of nervousness and happiness. George, ever composed, responded with a smile of his own. "If she's the right woman for you, then I want to meet her. Bring her over this weekend." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Richard was also preoccupied with Julia, his daughter. He saw her as an extension of his legacy and often tried to shape her to follow in the family's business footsteps. However, Julia was independent and determined, traits that led her to question her father's worldview. While she respected him, she was also intent on living a life that reflected her own choices. Julia had been with Ethan for months but avoided discussing him much with Richard. She knew her father harbored prejudices against people from more modest backgrounds and feared he wouldn't approve of their relationship. Despite this, when Ethan invited her to meet his family, she didn't hesitate. She was eager to see where he came from and to understand more about the life of the man she loved. On Saturday morning, the sky was clear, and the crisp air promised a peaceful day. George woke early, as usual, and began preparing the house for Ethan and his girlfriend's visit. Although he wasn't one for grand gestures, he wanted Julia to feel welcome. Max, his loyal dog, stayed close by, as if he too sensed that something special was about to happen. Ethan arrived just before noon, driving his pickup truck with Julia by his side. She was visibly excited, though she couldn't hide a hint of nervousness. As she stepped out of the vehicle, she was greeted by George's warm smile and a firm handshake. "So, you're the Julia my son can't stop talking about," he said, his playful tone instantly easing the tension. Julia quickly realized that George was a simple man, yet one with a quiet wisdom. The house was cozy, furnished with well-maintained antiques, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. During lunch, they talked about everything, from Ethan's childhood to stories about the farm. Julia was captivated by the lifestyle, so vastly different from the corporate world she had grown up in. Meanwhile, Richard had decided that day would be the one to settle the land issue once and for all. Without notifying anyone, he instructed his driver to take him to the landowner's address. His plan was to confront the man directly. In Richard's mind, a face-to-face conversation and a revised proposal would be more than enough to sway anyone. Around 3 in the afternoon, as George and the young couple sat on the porch laughing at a story Ethan was telling, the sound of an approaching luxury car disrupted the tranquility. George frowned, not recognizing the vehicle, while Ethan stood to see who it was. Julia also turned to look, but her face froze the moment she recognized her father stepping out of the car. "Dad," Julia said, her voice filled with surprise and confusion. Richard paused for a moment, taking in the scene. When his eyes landed on George, the shock was immediate. It was the man from the hotel, the same man he had treated with disdain. And now, here he was, at the home of a man who had not only rejected his multimillion-dollar offer but was somehow connected to his daughter. A heavy silence hung in the air as Richard remained by his car, clearly thrown off balance. Julia watched him, trying to piece together why he was there, while Ethan glanced at her, puzzled by her unexpected reaction. George, for his part, remained calm, though his eyes studied Richard with curiosity. Years of experience had taught him to recognize discomfort in others, and Richard's body language made it unmistakably clear. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Julia asked, her voice tinged with both surprise and concern. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but couldn't help casting a quick glance at George before responding. I'm here on business," he said, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. George decided to break the tension, his calm voice cutting through the awkwardness. "So, you're Julia's father," he said, extending his hand toward Richard. "I'm George Harris. Welcome to my farm." Richard hesitated for a moment before shaking George's hand, the memory of their encounter at the hotel now weighing heavily on him. "George Harris," Richard repeated, the name echoing in his mind. He finally grasped that he was standing in front of the man who had rejected his lucrative offers, who also happened to be the father of his daughter's boyfriend. The coincidence was almost too much to believe, and Richard felt uncomfortably exposed. Julia observed the interaction, sensing that something was amiss. "Wait, you two know each other?" she asked, looking between them. Richard let out a deep sigh, as though releasing a burden he had been carrying. "Yes, we've met," he admitted. "And unfortunately, the last time we met, I wasn't exactly polite." He cast a brief, regretful glance at George, who nodded, showing no signs of resentment. Feeling the need to address the situation directly, Richard began to explain with an unusual honesty. He recounted the incident at the hotel, describing how he had treated George rudely, not realizing who he was. He also admitted that he had been trying to buy George's land without success. Each word seemed difficult to utter, especially with Julia standing there, taking it all in. Julia stood still for a moment, surprised and slightly embarrassed by her father's behavior. "Dad, did you really do that?" she asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Richard, ashamed, could only nod. "I was wrong, Julia," he said with a sincerity he rarely displayed. "And I want to apologize, to you and to Mr. Harris." George, maintaining his calm demeanor, replied softly, "It takes courage to admit a mistake, Mr. Bennett. What matters isn't what happened before, but what we choose to do moving forward." His voice carried a wisdom that made even Richard feel small in his presence. The tension in the air began to dissipate, but the weight of the revelations still lingered. Julia, though visibly upset by her father's earlier actions, felt a hint of relief seeing him acknowledge his fault and offer an apology. She knew how rare it was for Richard to show regret, and this moment was a significant rarity in their relationship. Ethan broke the silence by suggesting everyone sit down. He gestured toward a shaded area on the porch, where rustic wooden chairs were arranged around a small table. Ever the gracious host, George brought out more coffee and placed a plate of freshly baked cookies on the table, a gift from his neighbor, something he always enjoyed sharing. As everyone settled in, Richard seemed uneasy, as though out of his element. He had never felt out of place before, but here, surrounded by a simplicity that starkly contrasted with his opulent life, he realized how disconnected he was from something authentic. George began to speak, easing the atmosphere. He shared stories about the farm, recounting how he had started with just a few cattle and gradually expanded his property through sheer hard work. Richard listened in silence, but every word seemed to spark a growing sense of admiration. He couldn't deny the respect he was beginning to feel for this man, whose resilience and determination stood in stark contrast to his own reliance on wealth and influence. Julia, observing the interaction, noticed a change in her father's demeanor. He didn't interrupt or ask pointed questions. He simply listened, which was rare for him. She also saw how George, with his humility and wisdom, had a natural ability to draw people into his stories. It was a gift, something that couldn't be bought or taught. When George finished speaking, Richard hesitated before taking the floor. "I see now that I made more than one mistake at the hotel," he said, looking directly at George. "I underestimated you. I underestimated what you stand for." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've never understood what it means to value something beyond numbers and business. I think that's why I'm here today. To learn." George nodded with a slight smile and replied, "Life has its ways of teaching us lessons, Mr. Bennett. Sometimes we have to lose to gain something far more valuable. But from what I can see, you have the chance to make things right. The question is, are you willing to change?" Richard felt the weight of those words like a blow of reality. For the first time, he was challenged not by numbers or contracts, but by something far deeper. Julia looked at her father with a mix of surprise and hope, while Ethan gently squeezed her hand, offering silent support. After a long moment of introspection, the tension on the porch began to ease. George, with his knack for lightening any situation, started asking Julia about her life in the city. He listened intently as she spoke about her work and the decisions that led her to carve out a path independent of Richard's corporate world. There was a sparkle in George's eyes as he glanced at Ethan, as if silently saying, "You've found someone special." As the conversation flowed, Richard's gaze wandered around the farm. The green fields, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and even the smell of damp earth were oddly comforting. It was a stark contrast to the concrete and glass world he inhabited. Yet it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years: peace. At one point, Richard spoke almost without thinking. "This is all quite impressive, Harris. The farm, the work, it's like every detail here has a purpose." His voice carried a rare tone of authenticity, surprising even himself. George, recognizing the sincerity in Richard's words, smiled and replied, "The land teaches you that. Every piece matters, every plant, every animal. Once you understand that, you realize you don't just own something. You're part of something bigger." Sensing the growing connection between the two men, Ethan seized the moment to speak. "That's why my dad has never wanted to sell the land, Mr. Bennett. It's not just property to him. It's the story of our family. And one day, I hope it'll be the story of mine, too." Julia squeezed Ethan's hand lovingly, moved by his words. Richard, on the other hand, felt small in the face of the profoundness of that perspective. He was so used to treating everything as numbers and investments that he had never considered the deeper meaning things could hold for others. The rest of the afternoon passed at a leisurely pace, filled with conversations about life, memories, and even a few laughs. Richard began to feel different, as though something was shifting within him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, George stood, looked around, and said, "Why don't we stay for dinner? I'm sure the farmhouse kitchen has something to please everyone." Richard hesitated, but Julia encouraged him. "It'll be good for you, Dad. Maybe something different from what you're used to." With no argument to counter her, he agreed. And in that moment, what had begun as a business visit was transforming into an encounter that would alter the course of their lives. Dinner was prepared with simplicity, but there was something special in every dish. With Ethan's help, George brought to the table a homemade meal that exuded warmth: herb-roasted beef, baked potatoes, and freshly baked bread from the farm. Julia was charmed by the care in every detail, while Richard, unaccustomed to meals without pomp, found himself genuinely impressed by the flavors and authenticity of the experience. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. George shared stories from his youth, recounting the challenges he faced to keep the farm running and how he had raised Ethan to value honesty and hard work. Julia, fascinated, asked questions about rural life, soaking in every detail. Richard, on the other hand, remained quieter, but it wasn't the silence of disinterest. He was absorbing something he hadn't realized he needed: a sense of belonging, something his wealth had never given him. At one point, Julia turned to her father and, in a soft voice, asked, "Dad, have you ever felt this way? Like being part of something bigger, the way Mr. Harris describes it?" The question caught Richard off guard. He set down his utensils and looked at the table for a moment, as if searching for an answer he had never truly considered. "I don't know, Julia," he admitted honestly. "I've always been so focused on building and expanding that I never stopped to think about it. Maybe I lost my way along the line." His response brought a reflective silence to the table. It was rare to hear Richard speak with such vulnerability, and everyone felt the weight of his confession. George broke the silence with his steady, reassuring voice. "It's never too late to find your way back, Mr. Bennett. Life gives us these opportunities, but it's up to us to recognize them and make the most of them." Ethan, sensing the impact of his father's words, added, "I think that's what love for something greater is all about, Mr. Bennett. It's not about what you own, but how you care for it." Richard nodded slowly, as if those words were planting something in his mind, something he knew he would need to nurture. He looked at George and Ethan, then at Julia, realizing there was something he had never given his daughter, the sense that she belonged to something bigger than business. The dinner ended with everyone feeling closer. Richard felt something new stirring within him, a mix of regret for what he had overlooked in life and hope that there was still time to change. When George stood to clear the dishes, Richard instinctively offered to help, something he rarely did. "Let me help," he said, surprising even himself. George smiled, accepting the gesture without a word. As the day came to a close, the farm seemed enveloped in a calmness Richard had never experienced in his life. In that moment, he began to see something he had never noticed before. True wealth wasn't in what he accumulated, but in what he was able to share. After dinner, night settled over the farm, bringing with it a silence broken only by the sounds of nature. Richard found himself sitting in a chair on the porch, gazing at the starry sky, something he rarely did in his hectic life. The city lights always drowned out the stars, but here, in the vastness of the countryside, every sparkling seemed to tell a story. He sat there for a while, lost in thought, as George joined him, carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. "A sky like this really makes you think, doesn't it?" George said, handing one of the cups to Richard. "Under these stars, problems seem smaller, and the important things come into focus." Richard held the cup but took a moment to respond. "I don't think I've ever stopped to look at the stars like this," he admitted. "I've always been so focused on the next deal, the next investment, that the present always felt like an afterthought." He turned to George and added, "But now, sitting here, I feel like maybe I've spent my whole life chasing something that could never fill the emptiness." George nodded, understanding the weight of Richard's words. "I've seen many men chase after things they thought were important, only to realize too late that what truly mattered was right in front of them. The difference is, not everyone gets the chance to figure that out while they still have time to change." Richard sat silently, letting those words sink in. He knew George was right. Throughout his life, he had amassed wealth and power, but every achievement came with a void he tried to fill with something bigger. Now, sitting here on the farm, he began to understand that the problem was never about what he had. It was about what was missing within himself. Julia and Ethan stepped out of the house, laughing about something they had been discussing, and joined them on the porch. Julia looked at her father with curiosity, noticing something different in his expression. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked gently. Richard looked at his daughter and, for the first time in a long while, felt truly connected to her. "Yes, Julia," he replied with a soft smile. "I think I'm starting to understand a few things." George watched the interaction with a satisfied expression, as if he knew the night was bringing more than just reflections for Richard. It was planting seeds that, in time, could grow into something transformative. The next morning arrived peacefully, with the first rays of sunlight illuminating the fields. George was already up, as usual, tending to the morning chores on the farm. He checked the stables, spoke with the workers, and made sure everything was in order. For him, the routine was part of what gave life its meaning. It was constant work, but the rewards went far beyond the material. Inside the house, Richard woke up earlier than usual. He wasn't accustomed to the sound of roosters or the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen, but there was something invigorating about the simplicity of the morning. He made his way downstairs and found Julia and Ethan chatting cheerfully at the table. They both looked happy, as if the tension from the previous day had dissolved overnight. Richard hesitated for a moment before joining them. "Good morning," he said, pulling out a chair. Julia smiled, surprised by her father's gesture. It was rare for him to be the first to engage in a relaxed setting, but here he was, almost fitting in as part of the family. Ethan offered Richard a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a short but genuine thank you. After some time, George entered the house, bringing with him a cool breeze from outside. He carried a basket filled with eggs and vegetables he had just gathered. "You're all still sitting here?" he teased. "Come on outside. There's plenty more to see and do on the farm." Julia and Ethan immediately perked up, eager to explore, but Richard hesitated. He wasn't sure what to expect from a morning on the farm, but something inside him urged him to participate. Together, they followed George as he walked them through the property, explaining every detail. He pointed out the fields, shared insights about his planting techniques, and even explained how he cared for the livestock. Richard listened attentively, noticing how deeply connected George was to everything around him. It wasn't just work, it was a life cycle he respected profoundly. At one point, as they walked through a flower-filled field, George turned to Richard and said, "I think the land has a lot to teach, even to those who live far from it. You just have to be willing to listen." George's words echoed in Richard's mind as he looked out over the fields. For the first time, he felt that perhaps something had always been missing in his life, a purpose greater than himself. Later that afternoon, Richard found himself walking alone through the property. He had slipped away quietly after lunch, feeling the need to process everything he was experiencing. The sound of birds, the wind rustling through the trees, and even the crunch of leaves beneath his feet created a natural symphony that was oddly comforting. He stopped near a fence where a few cows grazed peacefully. Watching the animals, he realized how everything here seemed to move at its own rhythm, without rush, without the constant pressure he had always felt in his life. Lost in his thoughts, Richard didn't notice George approaching until he was already nearby. The older man walked with his characteristic calm, holding a wooden cane that looked more like an accessory than a necessity. "I thought you might like some company," George said, stopping beside Richard. Richard looked at him and, after a moment, nodded. "You know, Harris," he began with a reflective tone, "I never imagined something so simple could feel so meaningful. It's strange to think I've spent so much time ignoring things like this." George smiled but didn't reply immediately. He gazed out at the fields before them and finally said, "Simplicity isn't meant to be ignored. It's in simplicity that we find answers to the questions that trouble us the most." Richard considered those words, feeling the weight of their truth. For years, he had built his life around acquisitions and achievements, but now he realized he had never stopped to ask himself why. He looked at George, admiring the calmness that seemed to radiate from him. "How do you do it? How do you find so much meaning in things I would have barely noticed before?" George gave a gentle smile and replied, "It takes time, Richard. Time and a willingness to learn. What you're seeing now is the result of a lifetime spent caring, not just for the land, but for the people around me. I believe that when we put our hearts into something, its value goes far beyond the material." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. It was a lesson he had never learned before. For him, everything had always been a transaction, a calculation. But here, standing beside George, he began to realize there was a kind of wealth that couldn't be bought. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. George placed a firm hand on Richard's shoulder. "You're on the right path, Richard. It might take time, but it's a good start." Richard said nothing, but something inside him shifted at that moment. For the first time, he felt ready to begin discovering what truly mattered. The days that followed brought a noticeable change in Richard. Although he wasn't a man prone to quick transformations, something about his time with George, Julia, and Ethan seemed to have sparked a new perspective. On the morning of his last day at the farm, he approached George, who was tending to some tools in the shed. Richard, wearing a borrowed cap that looked awkward on his head, had an expression that mixed nervousness and determination. "George," he began, his tone more personal than formal, "I've been thinking about everything that's happened over the past few days. I don't think I ever thanked you for letting me stay here, for showing me all this." He gestured around, indicating the farm, the open sky, and everything that made up a world that had once seemed so foreign to him. George set the tool aside, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at Richard with his usual patient gaze. "There's no need to thank me, Richard. I think we all learn something when we take the time to listen and observe." Richard offered a faint but genuine smile. "I don't know if I deserve the patience you've shown me, but you've helped me see something that, no matter how obvious, I never managed to understand: the value of people, their stories, and the things that can't be measured with money. I want to change, George, not just for myself, but for Julia, for Ethan, for everything I've ignored for so many years." George nodded, his calm smile returning. "Change isn't easy, Richard, but the good news is that you've already taken the first step. The humility to recognize that you need to change is the hardest part." As they spoke, Julia and Ethan approached, bringing with them a youthful and optimistic energy. Julia stood beside her father, holding his arm affectionately, something she hadn't done in a long time. "Dad, I'm proud of you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd say this, but I think you're changing for the better." Richard looked at his daughter, his eyes reflecting something she had never seen before: vulnerability. "I want to be someone you can be proud of, Julia," he replied. "And I want that to start now." George watched the scene with satisfaction, seeing the family bonds strengthening before his eyes. "You have a chance to start over, together," he said in an encouraging tone. "Make the most of it." The day continued with activities around the farm, but the atmosphere felt different. There was less tension, more smiles, and a growing sense of unity. For Richard, the farm was no longer just a piece of land rejected in negotiations. It had become a place where he had found something priceless, a new perspective on life. Months passed since Richard's stay at George's farm, and the transformation that had begun that weekend continued to shape his life. He took concrete steps to change his company, implementing more humane practices and genuinely listening to his employees' needs. Julia, who had once felt distant from her father, now saw a man learning to value what truly mattered. Their relationship blossomed, as did the friendship between the two families. The big day arrived, Julia and Ethan's wedding. The ceremony was held at the farm, just as the couple had dreamed. The decor was simple yet elegant, featuring flowers picked from the property and long wooden tables arranged under the open sky. The surrounding landscape looked like a scene from a painting, with golden fields and distant mountains framing the moment. George, as the host, welcomed the guests with his usual warm smile. Richard stood beside him, a transformed version of himself, more relaxed and in tune with the environment. He made it a point to help with the final preparations, carrying chairs and organizing details with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. For Julia, seeing her father working alongside George was proof that things had truly changed. When the ceremony began, all eyes turned to Julia as she walked across the field in a simple yet stunning white dress. Ethan waited for her beneath an arch made of branches and flowers, his expression one of pure devotion. George, standing beside his son, appeared deeply moved, while Richard, seated in the front row, watched with a mixture of pride and emotion. After the vows, when Julia and Ethan were declared husband and wife, the guests erupted into enthusiastic applause. The celebration continued into the evening, filled with laughter, dancing, and stories shared under the stars. Richard, who once avoided such interactions, was seen chatting animatedly with the farm workers and George's friends, listening to their stories with genuine interest. As the night reached its peak, George called for silence and raised a glass, capturing everyone's attention. "Today, we're not just celebrating the union of Julia and Ethan," he began, his voice rich with emotion. "We're celebrating the union of two families, two worlds that have learned to respect and grow with one another. Let this be a reminder that love and humility are the greatest legacies we can leave behind." Richard then asked to speak, something he rarely did without a carefully prepared speech. "I've learned more in the past few months than I have in my entire life," he began sincerely. "George has shown me that wealth isn't what we accumulate, but what we share. And tonight, I see that reflected in every face here. Thank you for showing me it's never too late to change." The guests erupted in applause once more, and Julia, moved to tears, embraced her father. George, with his serene smile, placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, a silent gesture of approval. In that moment, under the starry sky and surrounded by everyone who mattered, Richard felt something he had been searching for his entire life. He felt he was finally part of something greater. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let me know which city you're watching this video from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.